Okay, so let's maybe make a start here. So can everyone see my screen there? Just maybe get a thumbs up. Nicole, I can see you. That's good. Okay. Let's go to full screen. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today for our Powering Podiums. We're going to talk today about using movement screens to support athlete development. But I would like to start with a land acknowledgement and gratefully and respectfully acknowledge that our workplaces here at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific exist on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Lil'wat, Esquimalt and Songhees nations of the Coast Salish peoples. And I'm working from home today, and I'm speaking to you from the area of the Wasanich peoples, where I am grateful to live, work and play every day. So today we're going to start with introduction. You'll hear from myself, and then also on the call today we've got Nicole Janicek from CSI Pacific, Sean Nugent from the Langley Olympian Swim Club, and Steve Ramsbottom from the Performance Institute. We're gonna after those presentations, we've got a few little questions for you to put people into breakout rooms. Try to get a little bit of discussion going around this topic, and then we'll come back with questions and discussion. So those of you that have joined us for these Powering Podiums will know over the last two Powering Podiums were focused on talking about data, and now we're changing our data management process. And then we also did a session in November around succession planning. So we felt it would be a good idea to move back now to what would be our core business in this industry, which is athletes and coaches. So today's focus is what is a movement screen, and we're going to talk about the benefits and challenges of athlete screening, possibly adapting movement screens to specific sports, and then movement screens in para sports. And they're really going to be our three topics that we'd like to give you in the breakout rooms. But obviously you can speak about anything else related to it. So why do you do movement screens? I think that's an interesting question that I would have when I was a coach. What would it inform, or what does it inform? And would an adapted screen help us with our athletes and coaches? So a quick introduction of our speakers today. So we're happy to welcome Nicole Janicek, who's an S&C coach here at CSI Pacific. She's a previous judo team athlete. So I make it, my best intention is never to be on the wrong side of Nicole. She's a National Strength and Conditioning Association coach, CSCS registered. She supported judo, artistic swimming and athletics Canada, and she has a master's in Brock in applied health sciences. And Nicole specializes in pediatric exercise physiology. And I have had the pleasure to work with Nicole with younger athletes, particularly in the RBC training ground program, and would say that she is first class in that space. Okay, so somewhat, if we can get that turned off, that'd be great. Thank you. Also, looking forward to hearing today from Sean Nugent, who's an S&C coach with the Langley Olympian Swim Club. Sean's worked with Olympians in figure skating and weightlifting, and an Olympic gold medalist in mogul skiing. And as you can see, he's been involved in monitoring projects around ski and jump volume. The reason I'm really excited to hear from Sean today is that my understanding is that Sean, in a previous life, was involved doing some work for our institute with tennis in terms of adapting a movement screen there for tennis. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Sean. And then we're also going to hear from Steve Ramsbottom, who is the founder of Performance Institute. He was an S&C coach for the Vancouver Whitecaps from 2006 to 2012. And he's the author of the book of wheelchair training. And as you can see from his bio there, he's done a great amount of work with national parasports teams, wheelchair rugby, wheelchair tennis, men's and women's basketball, and also BC Para Ski Team. He's also worked with the Slovak national hockey team and with the Olympic figure skating medalist Kevin Reynolds. And Steve, I know you've worked with a lot of celebrities as well, but I didn't have enough room to put those on the slide, so I do apologize for that. It's great to have Steve here today because Steve can really give us some information here when it comes to parasport, which I think is an area that we need to do maybe a little bit work on in some of these sessions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing now. I'm going to hand over to Nicole and pass the floor to Nicole. Thanks, Nicole.
All right, see if I can share this. Okay, can we all see this? Okay, maybe Andrew, a little thumbs up.
Yeah, looks good. Sorry.
No problem. Okay, so like Andrew mentioned, my name is Nicole, and today I'm going to present on the introduction of movement screens. So just giving you an idea of what they are, how they can be used, and kind of what it's not. So we're going to start with a definition of just a screen. So from a clinical perspective, it's a strategy used to identify pathological conditions prior to an individual showing any specific signs or symptoms of that condition. It's usually used for early intervention and treatment. An example of that would be routinely scanning for certain types of cancer. Now, what about in an athletic context? So it can be tests that include fundamental movements that are characteristic of majority of sports or athletic disciplines. It may be an indication of function and control during those movements, and might be specifically looking at movement dysfunction, and therefore you can implement training protocols and then improving performance capabilities through those training protocols. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of a movement screen. In an athletic context, specifically strength and conditioning, this was really popularized by Gray Cook. He's a physical therapist, he is a strength and conditioning coach, among many other things. One of the things that he's most noted for is being the co-founder of Functional Movement Systems, which is its own brand, and they kind of encompass a lot of different screens. That is what they are known for. So you can take courses, you can take different levels of those courses, you can buy their certain kits, and it's a whole proprietary trademark term, right? So included in the functional movement systems is something like the functional movement screen, FMS, which is probably the most widely and popularized type of screen that's out there right now. And you're kind of looking at inefficient movement patterns. When it comes to the fundamental capacity screen, FCS, this is kind of looking at more what is limiting an athlete? How can we make them better? So looking at limitations from their ability to produce power or store and reuse energy or maintain posture under load. And then another popular one is the SFMA, which is the Selective Functional Movement Assessment. This one kind of builds upon the FMS, and you're looking at more so the root cause of inefficient movement patterns. And then you also have certain screens that are attributed to breathing and assessing breathing. So looking at dysfunctions there, using corrective exercises. And then lastly, within the functional movement systems, you have the Y balance test. So this could be looking at asymmetries from a left to right perspective and an upper and lower body perspective. So we're going to touch a little bit more on the FMS and SFMA and talk about the differences because they're probably the most popularized screens out there. So with the FMS, like I mentioned, you're identifying basic movement dysfunctions and asymmetries, and what they state is it's used to reduce the risk of injury. With the SFMA, it's more of a comprehensive tool. It's a bit of a building upon the FMS, and it's looking at the movement dysfunction, and then you're able to develop targeted strategies for those specific dysfunctions that you've kind of pinpointed. The tests are designed to identify whether it's a mobility issue, a stability or motor control issue, or both. And this one's going to specifically require a healthcare professional. So someone like a physical therapist, a chiropractor, physiotherapist, or some other sports med practitioner. So because the FMS is a little bit more readily used in an everyday environment, I want to break that down a little bit further so you get a further example of what that might look like. So when it comes to the FMS, it consists of 7 different exercises with their own criteria. Those exercises being a deep squat, a hurdle step, an inline lunge, shoulder mobility, active straight leg raise, trunk stability push-up, and a rotary stability exercise. Like I said, they all have their own criteria. And then each of these movements are going to be scored on a scale from 0 to 3. 3 indicating optimal movement, looks great. 0 indicating pain or inability to perform that movement. So if we have a look specifically at the deep squat exercise, that's a part of the FMS, it's going to require flexion and extension of the hips, knees, and ankles. It's going to require adequate mobility, stability, and neuromuscular control. So this is on the side here what a 3, a 2, and a 1 will look like. We're going to break that down a little bit. So with the 3, what you're going to have the athlete do is they're going to stand with their feet about shoulder width apart. It's okay if their toes are slightly out. They're going to have a dowel or a stick in hand. Ideally, it's going to be outside shoulder width. They're going to maintain that dowel overhead in line with their ears. If they were to bring that dowel down on top of their head, their arms should be roughly in a 90 degree position. Then they're going to punch the dowel back up and maintain that position overhead in line with the ears. You would ask the athlete to descend into the squat. So ideally, their hips are going to be below the level of their knees, and they're able to maintain an upright posture with their torso. So in the very bottom, the 3, where it's highlighted in green, that is perfect movement. There's no compensations. They can do it without pain. It looks great. So you would award them a 3. Now, per se, if they couldn't maintain that upright torso position or they can't get to the appropriate depth, then you may consider adding something underneath the heels. So that's going to restrict some range of motion and allow them potentially get further. If it cleans up the movement and they can now get to the adequate depth or maintain their torso position, they're awarded a 2. Now, if they still can't do it, even with their heels elevated, so you can see at the very top that 1 position, they can't get to the appropriate depth and they can't maintain that upright torso position. So they're given a 1. Now, in the event that they experience pain at any point, they're awarded a 0. That indicates some sort of dysfunction, and it needs to be checked further. So in an ideal world, I know the FMS said that it's used to reduce the risk of injuries, but what they've been criticized in the literature is that injuries are complex. So we're going to have a little bit of a chat about that. So these movements are kind of done in a closed environment. There's 7 exercises that may mimic athletic patterns that you may see in everyday sport, but they don't account for something like fatigue starting at the bottom of our pyramid. So you may have an athlete who is experiencing extreme tiredness from training or life stressors, and that may be from a period of few days to several weeks, or it could be looking at several weeks to several months, and they're not given the appropriate break or mental deload. And then that going into, let's say, a competition or a practice, and they're in a fatigued state could alter their movement patterns and lead to some sort of injury. It could also be due to the action that's occurring in the practice or the sport. So injuries can occur because of high speed, change of direction, single leg loading. And then another factor is physiological characteristics. Maybe they lack the strength or endurance and their form starts to fall apart during the practice or the game. What the FMS is really trying to get at specifically is this one piece of the pyramid, movement dysfunction. So it's looking at their ability to move properly, but you might pick out some inefficient movements, whether they have an asymmetry from right to left, something along those lines, right? And then lastly, it doesn't get at the fact that there are intrinsic factors that are unchangeable. So whether it's the athlete's age, their sex, or whether they've had a previous injury history, that's going to make them more prone to an injury. So the injuries are complex and multifactorial, and when we do these certain types of screens, they don't always account for everything that goes into an injury, right? There are some other considerations or issues with movement screens. So one of those being feedback. So as you're doing something like the FMS, you're going to tell the athlete how to perform it. You may even demonstrate it to them. And then you're going to watch them as they perform the movement. You're going to look at them from all angles, from the front, from the back, from the side, and then you're going to score them, right? That's it. Now, what it lacks is the ability to cue an athlete. That's not something you're supposed to do specifically with the FMS, right? So is the dysfunction that you're seeing really due to the athlete itself and something that is happening in their patterning? Or is it really a lack of understanding what the tester is asking them to do? Or maybe they have a lack of body awareness. So if I was actually able to cue that athlete and fix it within 2 seconds, then it's not necessarily dysfunction that I should be spending a whole lot of time working on. It's just a matter of cueing and practice. Another factor is environment. So movement patterns will differ based on the environment that the athlete is in. So the strategies that they use during certain scenarios may differ based on their environment. So let's say if they have a target while jumping, that could alter their movement strategy. Or if they have a defender in place per se, how they go about jumping or changing of direction could be very different, especially in that open and closed environment. And then you also want to consider having reliable measures, especially if you're going to say that this movement screen is going to reduce injury. You want to make sure that you have consistent and stable results over time and across different conditions. So when it comes to the FMS specifically, there's been reliability issues when it comes to the certain exercises. So shoulder mobility reliability differed from the hurdle step. It can be different from test to retest situations with the same athlete and or having different testers in the same place. So you want to make sure you're consistently doing the same things and under the same conditions. And if you're going to do it for, let's say, injury prevention, you have to take tests that have actually been validated in the research. Now, it's not to say that movement screens don't have their place in an athletic context. Movement screens are a tool. And these tools do come with their own limitations, right? So what I want to talk about is how they can be used a little bit differently. So it could just be a way to assess movement quality. That is important. So you're looking at weaknesses that need to be addressed for further evaluation. So it's not necessarily saying it's going to reduce the risk of injury, but it's something that you want to work on with your athlete to hopefully improve performance capabilities. And if they're trained appropriately, then it will. It could be a guidance for exercise prescription. So if I have an athlete do a squat, the overhead squat, I see that there's some sort of movement issues or dysfunction, and I know that they're not quite ready to do a barbell back squat with load to full depth. So from there, I could say, okay, this is something we're going to work on. Maybe we're going to start with a goblet squat to a targeted depth, and we're going to work through this. It can be used for a baseline for reassessment. So was that athlete actually able to go from the goblet squat all the way to the back squat using full depth? Can they now do the back squat under heavier loads? And does their movement form still look ideal, or did it break down? You could also look at it as a reassessment from an injury. How did they look before the injury? How do they look after the injury? And what does it look like after a few weeks or months of rehab? And then this is going to lead to improved communication and understanding of movement patterns from the coaches to the strength coaches to the physical therapist. And then it allows you all to be on the same page, especially when you're trying to improve the athlete and their capabilities. And then from a simplicity standpoint, it generally requires little equipment and it can be considered cost effective. Now, if you want to go through and do all the testing and do the certifications and use their specific kits, that might cost you a little bit, but it's not absolutely necessary to purchase those things, right? So I want to provide a little bit on guidelines. So if you're going to implement movement screens, what you want to do is implement tests that you deem appropriate for your own settings and clearly define how and why you're going to use it. Every sport team, every scenario is going to be different. And if it is something that you see of benefit, then that's great. Just clearly outline why and how you're going to go about it and try and keep that consistent across the board. Now, if you're looking at specifically reducing injury risk, you want to make sure that tests are validated for injury risks. So there are some out there. So some examples would be a single leg squat or star excursion balance test. And you want to use clearly defined criteria to improve consistency and reliability across the board, especially if you're not going to have the same testers in the same place, right? At least you have that criteria outlined. You want to provide feedback to determine if the dysfunction can be cleared through a simple movement correction or not. So this way, you know, is it actually the athlete and something that has happened in their previous sporting history or injuries, or, you know, based on the sport, maybe they just simply do have an asymmetry, or can I clear this up with a simple cue because they didn't understand? And then try to have the same testers and in similar conditions so you can account for the differences in fatigue level or timing of day. So reduce some of that issue that may occur. So if you test them, let's say at 5 a.m. and then the next time you go and do that test and it's actually at 6 p.m., well, it's kind of now comparing apples to oranges. What happened in those timeframes? And that actually might be the reason that you're seeing different results. And then you want to consider videoing so you can actually go back and review what their movement looked like. You know, it's great that you gave them a score of a 0, 1, 2, or 3, but if you can't see it, can you actually see the improvement that's happening over time? So when it comes to movement screens, they are tools to help improve performance capabilities. You might be looking at weaknesses or movement dysfunctions that can be addressed through training, and hopefully with appropriate protocols in place, it will transfer to sport. Movement screens are not specifically tests that are going to identify injury. Injuries are complex. So movement screens can make a positive contribution to a team's training environment, but you need to clearly define why and what you're doing with these screens. If you have a rationale, you can design your own systems for using these tests and effectively implement it into your daily training environment. Thank you. And let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm wondering, everybody, if we can keep those questions to the end, and then we can work on that. So, Nicole, if you can stop sharing your screen now, and then Sean, if you want to try and share yours, and if not, we can run it from my machine. So just bear with us here for a second, everyone. We'll see if we can get Sean's screen working. Okay, there we go.
Seeing my screen?
See that, Sean? Yeah, maybe just go to sort of presentation view, and it'll be good.
Where is that? Okay, everyone can hear me. Good to go?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, yeah, sorry about the technical difficulties. I'm not able to get my webcam working, but here are the slides that I've got for today. So I'm going to be talking about my experiences in adapting a screen to different sporting situations. So 3 primary sports I've worked with in the last 10 years at different performance levels and different age levels. So initially I was working with CSI Pacific with the Canadian mogul ski team. And in that national sport organization, we worked with the Next Gen World Cup and Olympic team. In 2021 and 2022, early 2022, I did a project with Tennis BC where we were doing a movement screen and then some interventions following the movement screen and then a follow-up movement screen. And I have a lot of thoughts and experiences of how that process all went. During that time, it was during COVID restrictions, so that presented some more challenges. And then finally, where I'm at now, working with the Langley Olympian Swim Club, we have athletes everywhere from the early age group to provincial team to Canadian junior and senior national team members, and also some para national team members as well. Okay. So I tend to look at a few things at the start of a movement screen. I'd like to look at a few key performance indicators. So are there specific scientific or anecdotal evidence to support certain factors that can contribute to higher performance levels? I look at epidemiology, which is a study and analysis of the distribution of health and injury in a defined demographic. In each of these sporting cases, that's the sport itself and the age group or even performance level that you're looking at. And this can be informative regarding risk and preventative interventions for this demographic. But as Nicole mentioned, these movement screens aren't to identify injury risk and prevent injuries. Injuries tend to happen, especially acute injuries, where the load is exceeding the body's capacity to handle it. And then a final thing that I look at is the observation and evolution of the movement screen. Are we seeing what we're seeing in the movement screen relate to what is happening in competition, in sport training, and in our strength and conditioning sessions? Are there non-negotiables in that sport? So for instance, a non-negotiable, I'll give a few examples of those, but if an athlete doesn't have a capacity to get in a full range of shoulder flexion and certain sport movements require that of them, their performance ceiling is going to be lower because their body can't move the way that it's required to. Is the movement screen investigating and identifying relevant information? So when I first started with CSI and Moguls, they had a well-established movement screen and testing battery, which they did twice per year, once at the very beginning of the season, and then once the month before the competitive season started. And it was quite general, very physiotherapist led, and I felt we weren't capturing a lot of things, for instance, that we weren't looking enough at force and velocity and asymmetries and fatigue and how those things change movements. And finally, can your movement screen be adapted to improve? For instance, like I said, with Moguls, we were doing that twice per year, but following that up, we began to practice those movements and develop those movements on a daily basis. And then in addition, we look to move towards a few more specific movements that would help us along our way to better performances or, improved health. So first I'll talk about my time with Moguls. So some of the KPIs that were identified were volume on-hill training. And this came from the head coach who had over 10 years of training data and performance data. And the team had been the best in the world for over a decade, several Olympic medalists, World Cup medalists. And, he did some statistics on these performance metrics and volume metrics. And he was very confident that to be an international podium skier, you would need to have a certain amount of volume so that you would have a certain amount of quality within that volume. And sometimes if athletes didn't have the amount of robustness or capacity to handle the volume, his concern was that they were never going to get enough reps to develop the quality. Another KPI is the on-hill jump amplitude. In Moguls, there's 2 jumps, and you get scored. It's a subjective sport where it's judged. And part of your scoring on the jumps goes into jump amplitude and your degree of difficulty and how well you execute. Another key performance indicator is your lower body range of motion, because as they ski through the Moguls, they're essentially doing full range squats all the way down basically to the bottom of the range that they possess. And since it is a subjective sport, what looks good scores well, and better posture scores well. Some of the epidemiology in the sport is knees. There's a very high rate of acute ACL injuries, not just in Moguls, but in all skiing, and shoulders. And that comes from the repetitive pole planting that takes place in the moguls. Okay, and some of the observation and evolution. So for instance, in moguls, at the takeoff position of the jump, which I'll show a picture of next, shoulder flexion, active range of motion is non-negotiable, because if you can't do that, you can't create the jump amplitude or achieve the judge scores that you're looking for. Or you might try to achieve that shoulder flexion range of motion, but you might cheat to do it by doing something called a compensation. So you might get a little bit more extension through the back, which leads to not being able to execute the jump correctly or to the highest level possible because you've lost your body line. We practice, and part of the evolution was seeing how people were scoring in their twice a year movement screens. We knew that we need to practice these movements every day to improve at them. So we were doing basic mobility, calisthenics, core, single leg strength, and landing mechanics sessions prior to skiing every day. And in the 2018 Olympic season, it's just a breakdown of the days we had. They were on the road 235 days a year with support of their ski coaches, physio, massage therapists, and strength and conditioning coaches. They were home 100 days a year in between competitions and camps, where they were supported by their local S&C, whether that was in Vancouver or Montreal or Penticton, Toronto, all over the place. And then they had 30 days off. So they had 335 days a year where they were being coached and supported to develop better movement quality and higher capacity to tolerate what they're being exposed to in the sport. So this is one of the takeoff positions that you'll see in a mogul jump. And as you can see here, there's an excellent line created through the feet all the way through the lower body, the hips, the shoulders, the head, and the full shoulder flexion of the arms. So when I said, this is a non-negotiable movement, because if you can't do that, you're not going to be able to execute the jump as well as you could have, or you're not going to be able to create the jump amplitude that you ideally want. These are just some of the exercises. So before I show the video, we practiced just basic shoulder flexion every single day. It started on lying on your back, making sure that your back was pressed flat on the floor, rib cage down, and then controlling that shoulder flexion, moving your arms from your hips all the way overhead and maintaining that line. We progressed that to a standing position where your back was pressed against a wall behind you and doing that same movement. And then we did different things to increase the demand. So here's an example of just adding a little bit of load to the shoulder flexion. And with that increased load at the end range of motion, can the athlete maintain the integrity of their core position and keeping their back pressed flat on the floor? Okay, so that was one. Another thing we did was we tried to just add little rotational demands and see if they could maintain that core position. So here's another example. I'll just mute that. And this was actually a World Cup athlete rehabbing an ACL injury. So again, we're practicing these movements that we're assessing on a daily basis. Some of the skiing positions that we're looking for, as I mentioned, are a large range of motion is needed at the hip, knee, and the ankle. They have to have a stable head and upright upper body and stable arms for the pole planting. And these were very important qualities so that the athletes could score well. This, again, is just some of our daily mobility that we did. And one thing I'll say is when I came to the team, I was heavily biased towards the traditional strength and conditioning activities, and these daily movement sessions were a little bit new to me. So it took me a while to warm up to some of the things, but I started doing some of my own tests to validate and see if we were actually improving what the coaches said these things would improve. So it's just a basic squat here and a rotation to each side, working on a great upright chest, stable head. And like I said, we would do this 200 and some odd days a year and coach very basic movements to a high level. And for my own personal journey, I wanted to look at whether these were actually improving the posture. So what you'll see here is an overhead squat that we did with a dowel, basically a broomstick. And I evaluated this every 4 days with the athletes to assess whether the activation and training that we were doing was creating adaptations in sport specific range requirements and postural control. So if you look closely on the images, there's all these different measurements there, and those are showing squat depth, knee angle, ankle dorsiflexion angle, hip angle, trunk angle, and their shoulder flexion and stability in the deepest range. And one of the things during this process that I learned from the women's head coach was that he said, these two athletes in particular are demonstrating what he would say is a very desirable mogul skiing position where the torso angle and the shin angle are quite parallel. Okay, next up was my experience working with the tennis provincial sport organization. Was contacted by CSI to basically do a movement screen. So I worked with a physiotherapist that I know quite well, Dr. Linda Trong, and we developed our own movement screen. And then we were meant to give specific training interventions. And then we were meant to do a follow-up movement screen to see how our interventions hopefully led to positive improvements in the movement screen scores. And this took place during the Canada Games season. So I think that was 2022, and we started this during 2021. One of my greatest learnings during this process was, we researched ATP and junior elite levels. We identified the common epidemiology, which is overuse in, elite junior world population. The literature showed the most common injuries were acute injuries of the lower body, the knee, hip, and ankle, and chronic overuse injuries of shoulder impingement, elbow, and trunk. And another piece of literature showed that in elite Irish juniors, it was a 2-year prospective study, 54% of players in the junior demographic experienced injury. And then there was also strong evidence that warm-up, strength training, specific intervention programs reduced injury rates. Unfortunately, what we found was we tested and we found the common weaknesses and overuse symptoms in many of the athletes, particularly the shoulder. So during that time, I talked to the director of player development and said, what we're finding in these athletes age 15 to 18 is they have some of the overuse or asymmetries or imbalances that the literature told us that this demographic has. And I think we would be better served if we were starting younger and developing these qualities in dedicated training sessions with exercises specific to the population and developmental and performance levels. And this would help earlier in their careers, because once they hit a certain age, the competitive season starts to demand so much of their time that it was actually very challenging to even get together for the movement screens. And this would also take place prior to the development of some of their overuse symptoms from repetitive movements of being high-level tennis players. I feel that we could have been far more effective teaching and strengthening the movements instead of testing and finding what the literature suggested. I do feel that would yield better results for the invested time and money. And then where I am now, it's the Langley Olympian Swim Club. We have, reasonably high level performers in the club from the provincial junior national team. That's meant to say SR, senior national team, and the para levels. However, what I found is this does not mean that they would perform well in a movement screen. Some of the epidemiology that's been presented is overuse of the shoulder. And when I talk about overuse, I'm not saying oh, we need to train less. We actually need to find ways to increase the robustness and the capacity of the athletes so that they can handle more volume. And because that's where you're going to be able to make your improvements in conditioning and skill, kind of like the mogul skiing coach said, you need a certain amount of volume in order to hit a certain amount of quality in the sport. And then I've done a few initial intakes of movement screens with senior and junior national team high performers in our programs. And actually, they are the ones who have some of the overuse shoulder issues or the limited range of motion or the limited function. For instance, two of these athletes on the junior national and senior national team, they weren't able to do pull-ups because they would feel a great deal of pain even if they initiated a pull-up. So, I'd never worked with these athletes before, but there was they were chronically high volume trainers. And as we got going, we had to help improve the function of their shoulder so that they could improve things like strength through pull-ups so that they could apply more force to the water, swim faster, things like that. I found the same observations and evolutions in the swim club as I did in tennis. Was let's start younger and develop these qualities, and we actually need to do it coached more frequently to achieve the repetition and quality. So those numbers I showed earlier with mogul skiing, they were supported 230 days a year in doing these basic movements, and we're not quite there yet with the swim club, but that's somewhere I think that we need to go. Here's an example of one of the key swimming positions. I would say this is a non-negotiable for performance. As you can see, this is called a streamline. As you can see here, there's a great deal of shoulder mobility. They've got their arms up in a full shoulder flexion, and they've got great trunk alignment and stability. So their hips are quite in line with the rest of their body. There's not an arch through the back, which would create a significant amount of drag. When I first got into strength and conditioning, I remember talking to the biomechanist for Swimming Canada, and he was also at the time a biomechanist for mogul skiing. And I asked him, what are some of the key strength and conditioning activities that swimmers need to do to develop? And he said, well, actually, all the stuff you're doing in the gym and dryland is great, but what we're finding is swimmers at the Olympic level are, and he said in 2012, 50% of the Canadian Olympic team was not able to do a streamline at an elite international level. And that was prior to Swimming Canada's great success, which started in 2016 and has continued since then. So he said, athletes and coaches need to get engaged with mobility so that they can get in the right positions to execute skills at a high level. Here's one of the key swimming positions. I had a colleague from USA Swimming send this to me, and this is actually in Rio at the Rio Olympics, and this is one of the greatest backstrokers in history from Japan. And there's one of the staff members from Japan working with him, fine-tuning this crucial, really basic movement. I say basic because it's one of the first movements that you learn in swimming. And what I wanted to draw out here is that even the world elite are getting coached to a high level in this. Okay, so this is one of the athletes I work with, and he's a Canadian senior national team member. He just got 10th at World Championships. And if you look at his streamline, and this is when I first assessed him before I started working with him in January 2021, you look, there's not the full range of shoulder flexion. His head is tucked down a little bit. His ribs are flared up, and there's a little bit more arch through the back than you would like. If you go back to the other swimmer, things are a lot more in line. And then, so this is actually a video. I'll play it and stop it at certain places. So he'll move here. You see the ribs are quite flared out. And right there, there's these gaps a little bit in here between the arm and the head. And these are not ideal for lowering drag in the pool. Okay, so if you flash forward 2 months later, we had created a slight improvement in the shoulder flexion range of motion. The head isn't quite tucked down as much. And in practice, here's a video from last summer in our underwater video, just looking at the streamline quality. So you can see things have gotten a little bit better. And you pause here on the stroke entry. So one more time. Okay, so good. So on to the next slide. This is data from Swimming Canada. So on the middle column, it's looking at the 15-meter streamlines coming off of the wall. In his event, it's a 400-meter event. There's 8 times 50-meter segments. And we quantified the streamline performance from 0 to 15 meters on each of those lengths, except the very first one. We didn't have the data for that. And then on the left column, you have his performance from the 2023 World Championships in July. And on the farthest column over on the right, we have the performance change. Everything in everything in green is an improvement, and everything in gray is neutral or a non-improvement. So overall in his race, actually, he dropped 1.36 seconds. The streamline improvement counted for 0.8 seconds. So that equals 58.8% of his performance change in time was through the streamline, which we started working on back in 2021. And it was something we identified that he was lacking in the movement screen, was that shoulder flexion range of motion. So just a fun way to tie it all together and how it relates to performance. Well, that's basically all for me. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I will pass it on to Steve next.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Sean. That was great. And we'll just move on to Steve now.
Okay, so everyone can see my slides okay?
Not yet, Steve.
Not yet. Okay. Figures it worked in practice.
It did. Okay, we have some movement now, yeah.
That's better?
There we go.
Okay. So hello, everybody. I think this is going to tie in really well to what Sean was just talking about. I had a lot of like, yep, bang on, I agree with what he's saying. For my talk, I've had a lot of experience working with different para sports, and it's kind of interesting as we go. Oh, sorry, one sec here, guys. There we go. One of the things that I was asked to do working with wheelchair basketball was to travel the country and try to find different sectors where strength and conditioning people could start working with the basketball players. And what we found was there's a lot of hesitation working with para athletes, just that there wasn't a lot of information. This is 20 some years ago. And that led me to wanting to write a book on it. And when I first started, what I found was I got to work with an athlete, Marnie Abbott, and she showed me a picture of the women's national team. And the first thing that struck me was I saw everyone's posture, going back to what Sean was saying, and everyone's posture was quite rounded. And I was like, well, okay, what's going on here? And I didn't have a lot of experience working with para athletes at the time. And very quickly, I started to understand, okay, this is something really important for all these parameters that we've been talking about: injury prevention and power production and performance, longevity in the sport and health. All these things are critical. So in my experience, I have tried to make commonalities, and the hard thing that I've found in parasport is there's so much variety within the sport. Here's a shot of one of our wheelchair basketball players years ago on our skating treadmill. And one of the things that I did try to do was come up with a standardized approach for doing energy system training. And in wheelchair basketball, there's different classifications depending on the level of injury. And I thought, you know what, this is going to be a great way. I'm going to be able to have classifications, and we're going to be able to come up with these endurance parameters and goals. And I found there's so much variety within each classification. It was really hard to do. And for you know, some of the tests, for example, I would have one athlete in the same classification getting about 20 seconds on this treadmill test. And then I would have Richard do it here, and I'd stop him at about 4 minutes. So there was such a great range that it's very challenging to do. So within the setup, or within the assessment, a number of things that we look at. We look at the chair setup, depending on the sport. Certain athletes may be in a higher position, wheelchair tennis or basketball, for example, where maybe they're trying to get a rebound, or maybe they're trying to reach balls. Muscle functionality and balance. What do we have to work with here? Is there neural issues, strength issues? What's going on? Posture is a massive thing that we look at, and we'll show some more slides on this. And general range of motion, looking primarily neck, shoulders, trunk, hip flexors, and then different things that we look at as well: core stability, muscular power, agility, strength, and then the energy systems. So this is an athlete I got to work with. He came to me wanting to climb the Chief. And one of the things I found in para sport is you always need to excite them about training. I've found by the time they get to you, they've often been told what they can or cannot do. And it's our job to remind them that they're athletes, and we need to focus on their abilities and what they can do, not what they feel like they cannot do. So always find with good training, you can always get a lot more than they've realized. So I love this old quote: if you have a body, you are an athlete. So some common problems that we found in para athletes: anterior shoulder rotations. So the shoulders are tending to drop forward, leading to shoulder impingement, bicep tendonitis, really big overuse issue, the wrists from pushing in the chair. They're not using their legs for locomotion, so their wrists do take a lot of impact, and that's something that we do try to work with, be it straps or other additional supports. And then general weakness, basically all the postural muscles, so the external rotators, rhomboids, mid-traps, all these different muscles that really help control what the shoulder's doing. And quite often these this is their support system. So they need to get this really strong, because this is essentially their core, which we'll talk about. And then common tightnesses. So we're looking at neck, upper traps, pecs, delts, lats, biceps, hip flexors are a big one. So these are all things that I feel like within a screen or an assessment, we need to really take a good look at. So as I alluded to with wheelchair basketball, every classification is unique. They'll typically do, for classifying athletes, they'll look at they'll do their own movement screen and see how far they can lean forward to the side, and then get a general idea of their classification, where they should be. I've seen quite often, you know, an athlete at a provincial level can be classified differently on an international level too. So there's variety within this sometimes. Depending on the level of injury, are they complete or incomplete? Is it a full break? Less common now for that. Determine functional musculature. So depending on where the level of injury is, you may have an athlete that has a functional lat on one side and an oblique on another side, and then another athlete within the same sort of classification may be totally different. What is their lifestyle like? Is it quite sedentary? Or I've also had athletes where, you know, they're in a chair and they're pushing you know, a half hour to get to the court or to their practice all the time. And then we really need to look at some overuse issues with those athletes. And then again, different things going on within the body, joint issues, Neurological issues, is there a discrepancy between what the body is capable to do from a neurological standpoint, or is it just purely strength? And then again, like Sean alluded to, sport specific needs. Are there specific positions that are required for the sport to be successful? And again, within the para sport, I think more than most anything else, it depends on the classification. You could have you know, a 4-5 in wheelchair basketball who has a completely different skill set and requirements than a 1. So it really depends. So posture, I think this is a big thing. I love these quotes. Posture dictates function, and the old Charlie Francis, if it looks right, it flies right. Here's one of our old basketball players doing a single arm chin up. So as much as I talk about posture and mobility, strength is certainly of great importance. So just a bit of background with para athletes. The lumbar spine, looking at their hip flexors is really critical. Sitting all day gets the hip flexors to really tighten up. This is something that we've tried to do a lot of within our training. So the spine has a backwards S curve, and what we found is when you know, this psoas and iliacus, the psoas especially, when that starts to pull on the spine, it drags the spine forward, and that the spine is going to try to balance itself out. And what we'll see is the upper back really start to round as well to compensate. So as it says here, the body's always trying to find its balance point, and tight hip flexors and the requirements of locomotion in the chair may lead to an increased kyphosis, which is this rounding of the upper back, and a head forward position. This posture lengthens the T-spine, so all that upper back, and overloads the rotator cuff, making it susceptible to overuse and early degeneration. So within our screening, again, we're doing postural screens, and some of the things we're looking at, again, anterior rotation of the shoulders. You can see here, the head of the shoulder is in a forward position. I did this FMS style. His eyes are closed, and I did not give him any cueing on how to sit. I just had him sit naturally in his basketball chair. We're looking for wing scapula. Are the shoulder blades pulled right off the rib cage? What's the functionality of that shoulder? Shoulder alignment, again, depending on the sport, depending on the injury, the strength imbalance, is there going to be a alignment issue within the shoulders? Head forward position, again, a lot of these athletes are fighting for balance, and that head forward position really helps them. So we need to work with that and have some things that'll accommodate that and counter that within their strength training. And then spinal alignment, how is everything looking? Are there you know, kyphosis issues of rounding, or do they tend to shift a lot of times? If you know, they'll sit in their sport chair with one leg crossed, and that gets the hips to rotate and the spine starts to rotate. So we really need to be careful their alignment and position so they can function optimally, and then prevent injury as well. So some basic movements. I've just got a couple photos here of some real basic range of motion tests that, again, speaking of non-negotiables, like I think every athlete needs to be able to rotate their head and try to look over their shoulder. What we found with a lot of the para athletes is their necks are compensating all the time, so they get so tight. So looking at rotation, lateral flexion of the neck, shoulder flexion, extension, what's their ability to do that? We've had many athletes not able to come overhead. And sidebar, if you're ever testing somebody in a chair, you're going to note that Yuka here, she's angled back. So we need to look for not a straight vertical line, but that arm should actually be coming back more. So we get that nice 180-degree angle overhead ideally, or into extension about 50 to 60 degrees. And what we find is these two areas are very tight within most athletes. Depending on what we do, if I would be working in a team setting, I would be doing something like an Apley scratch test. So we're looking at, you know, external shoulder range of motion, internal shoulder range of motion, which would just be the arm coming the other direction, reaching to the opposite shoulder blade. We want to see what's their ability to rotate their arms If I was in more of a private setting, I may get them on the table and test it a different way. But point being, we need to make sure they've got adequate range of motion for pushing, because their internal rotators, meaning their pecs, their biceps, especially lats, all get really tight, and that is dragging that shoulder forward, like we talked about, and creating some issues. We talked about hip flexors. So the old Thomas test is a good one to see what's going on with the hip flexors. This is something that we try to preach our athletes do on the edge of a bed every morning, or even lying on their stomach, just to help work on lengthening out those hip flexors, because it's just a daily stretch that they should be doing. Some are able to stand, and then it's less of an issue. But for those athletes that are sitting all the time, it's very important. So some other things we're looking at: palpation, just feeling around what's going on in the upper traps. How tight is that? Matching that with the range of motion they have within their neck. Bicep tendons, we're feeling for thickness, we're feeling for pain. Is there any issues? That will usually come out in the shoulder extension test that we went over. If that's limited, it's usually going to be pretty thick through that biceps tendon and be creating pain. Symptoms of shoulder impingement is there pain basically through the front of the shoulder. Usually we'll see some mobility issues, and we'll usually see some strength issues as well through those postural muscles in the upper back we talked about that need work. And then also palpating through the forearms. They're doing so much gripping, grabbing onto their wheels, that the forearms get really tight. And what we've seen with a lot of athletes, something I always check is looking at their ability to supinate their hands. Can they actually turn up? So a lot of them are so restricted, they're actually stuck to about neutral, and they can't fully rotate. So these are just a few of the things that we will look at within our screen. And then looking at core. So here's a great example of core strength. What is the core? So the core is a group of muscles that stabilizes and controls the pelvis and spine, and therefore influences the legs and upper body sometimes. Core strength is less about power and more about the subtleties of being able to maintain the body in ideal postures to unload the joints and promote ease of movement. So when I talk about the core, I always like to come back to this keystone theory, those big Roman archways where you had that one really critical stone, and if that was not in place, the rest would crumble. And parasport brings a different lens to how we need to stabilize the body, because not all athletes have functional abdominals and the low back and multifidi and all these muscles that work to support the trunk. So they need to get it somewhere else. So we need to find where their core is, and then we need, as best we can, to try to work on stability of that. So again, what does core training do? So we're stabilizing center of gravity within its base of support, controlling forces through the trunk, torsional, shearing, compressional forces, activation of agonist, kind of the working, and then antagonist, the supportive muscle groups, increased balance, body control, and decreasing injury, improving posture. And with all this stuff, our goal is always the same. It's injury prevention, making sure they can actually play and do what the coaches are wanting them to do, and improve their overall performance. And just a couple side notes for strength training these athletes. So with my lens, I'm generally thinking develop mobility and alignment first. If they're not in a good position, back to the Charlie Francis quote, it won't fly right. So you need to make sure that position is optimal so we can get good performance. And then again, alluding back to what Sean said, every sport is a little unique on what's required, but as an overall generalization, we need to be able to get these athletes into good positions. Because of the overuse that we see, this is one case where I have sometimes, and this is somewhat of a rarity really, but I put this in because sometimes I've had to do this to get rid of shoulder issues, is eliminate any pressing, vertical, horizontal pressing, because they're doing so much of it. Not to say that we never do, but there may be a stage where it's really required to decrease it. We'll use a lot of spinal support whenever possible. to help get these athletes into a good position. So we may have their back up against the post, or we may have them lying down on the floor, and teach them that depression retraction, trying to teach them how to stabilize their shoulders properly. We'll use wrist straps quite often. We talked about the overuse of the wrists and issues that can happen from there. And we'll use dowel sticks for supporting the athletes, because I often find the brakes on chairs aren't great. So we'll have some extra assistance there. And myofascial release, self-massage. We do a bit of soft tissue release here as well. But getting massage therapists involved and those sorts of things go a long way with these athletes. So to kind of cap, again, with any athlete that we're looking at, we need to look at the overall volume, including their lifestyle, and then get addressing their strength, their energy systems, speed, power, and technical. And again, going back to peak performance, it's always an art and a science. So there's a lot of science to it, but working with individuals, it's always going to be unique and some problem solving in there to make it right. And that is that. Thank you very much.
Okay, Steve, many thanks for that presentation, and to Sean and Nicole, some great information there. Steve, I wonder if you could just stop screen sharing for a second. I'm kind of thinking, because we don't have a huge audience, and I don't want to lose people through breakout rooms, which does sometimes happen. I wonder if maybe we would just go to sort of questions here, and maybe try to get some discussion going within the group. So I'm just going to, in the chat box, these were the questions that I had suggested, right? So why do we do movement screens? And again, I'm thinking from a coaching perspective, what does the movement screen inform? And would an adapted screen help your athletes and coaches? And I kind of feel, when I was putting those together, that the answer to question 3 would be obviously yes. But so that was my try at putting some questions together. But I wondered if we had some questions from people who have been on the call to any one of our presenters. If you maybe want to just open your microphone and come on and come on and ask that question.
Yeah, maybe I have a question. I worked with a lot of basketball players and soccer players, and one thing we see a lot is like lateral ankle injuries. We do mobility assessments, but it seems to be like a lot in the proprioception. And we look through literature, and we're kind of struggling to find a screening tool that could help to see if there's any deficiency there. And I'm wondering if you would have some ideas as to how we could screen for this and have like an intervention to reduce lateral sprains and things like that.
Okay, who would like to take that one on? Oh, Steve, I think you're on mute there. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. So I can't give you any literature to quote on, but I know I've had a chance to work with Alex McKechnie, who's he used to be a physiotherapist just upstairs from us, and he's with the Toronto Raptors now. And I know something that he was always preaching with that is, yes, we can certainly look at adequate range of motion and proprioceptive type drills, but he would always talk about looking at the body as a complete unit and really making sure that, he would use different examples of Kobe and all these different people, but just looking at their ability to handle loads and impact. So making sure that the athlete is actually stable. So I guess my answer is looking at the entire system as opposed to just the ankle. So how is that athlete absorbing force? Are they actually stable and support through their midline? Are they braking? Again, some of those shots Sean was showing is really good. Just seeing like how some slight breaks is creating these energy leaks, and it's going to cause a blowout somewhere. So I think my suggestion for you would be certainly include some of the injury preventative ankle stuff that I'm sure you're doing, but really make sure you're including drills that are getting that whole body challenged within the system, and they're being supportive and they're staying in, a good neutral spine and braced as well. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, well, I'd like to ask Sean a question, really, and I guess it's around that when you were presented with the challenge of building a screen for tennis. What were your first thoughts around that, and then where in what direction did you go?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a few notes here. Just have to refresh myself. You guys are able to hear me, right? Okay. Yeah, initially, we wanted to look at, like I said, the injury surveillance in the ATP and elite juniors. And then from there, we looked at, common tennis movements. If you're moving forward, backwards, laterally to make a play, you have an inevitable deceleration you need to do. You maybe need to plant a leg laterally to accelerate in the other direction. So in our movement screen, we looked at things like plant leg mechanics in multi-directional lunges, not just what they were doing with the lower body, but kind of like Steve said, looking at the system as a whole, how their posture was maintained. If they plant the leg and their upper body starts drifting beyond where their plant leg is, well, they're not going to be stable, and they're not going to be able to accelerate out of that position and make a play. So they might lose a point there, in the rally, just because the mechanics of the plant leg didn't allow them to keep up with the play. We did, my physio colleague, Linda, she had a dynamometer, and she was looking at the different torque and velocities of the shoulder, because we had found in the literature, that the shoulders were a common place of injury. We used force plates. We looked at, a dual force plate system, looking at landing mechanics, jumping mechanics, but the forces, both concentric and eccentric, and the landing of various types of jumps, so that we could see the difference between right and left leg. And that was something I learned while with moguls was, if you have greater than 10% asymmetry, you're at a higher risk of injury. And this was Dr. Matt Jordan from CSI Calgary and University of Calgary that did all this in his PhD studies, because it was basically, there was such a high rate of ACL injury in the alpine skiing population. And then aside from just injury, there was a whole lot of re-injury of those athletes when they would return to sport. So they're trying to look for ways where they could basically quantify good levels where you are safe to return. So, we were being proactive, looking at those force plate tests to see how these young tennis players were presenting on the force plates, so that, we could limit or mitigate some of the risk they might experience with some of the acute lower body injuries, which is what the literature showed, the injuries of the hip and knee and ankle, and, just looking at asymmetries there. And then aside from that is just kind of the general movement screen type activities, which Nicole mentioned and described and explained. We used all those as well, but the additional sport specific stuff was the jumping, the landing, the multi-directional lunging, plant leg mechanics, and things like that.
Okay, so I guess from a, and again with the coach's hat on as well, sort of thinking were you able to sort of build a report out and go back to tennis and maybe with some suggestions in terms of training some of the routines, or maybe even how that might affect warm up or some practice
Oh, yeah.
design?
Yeah, absolutely. So we looked at, we created a report of basically, what they did well, where they were within, acceptable norms, where they were, a little bit weak or imbalanced or lacking something. And, we helped periodize that through their yearly training plan because they're very, very busy athletes, actually, tennis players. And, I said, this is the kind of stuff I feel in order for athletes to be successful with training interventions, it needs to get done. And if it needs to get done, then it has to be within a place where it's easy to get done. I like to put it in warm ups in particular. You're warming up on a daily basis or sometimes twice a day. So you get a high frequency of repetition of the exercises that you need. So we help find places within their, weekly training schedules to integrate the specific activities that they needed within their tennis warm up.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Steve, I did want to maybe ask you a question, and this comes from a conversation I had with Kevin Bowie a number of times, and it's around, movement screens and how movement screens might help with classification or might help to reclassify athletes in that para sport. And I don't have a background in para sport, but Kevin did, so I thought I would ask that question on his behalf.
Well, I'm certainly no specialist into how they do the classification. I know they do some basics on range of motion of trunk leaning forward, like how far can they reach out. Those are some of the basics that they're doing. It's tough, you look at like Paris swimming, for example, there's so many different classifications within that. I don't know how you make it better with a different sort of screen from what they're doing. I don't know. All I can really comment on is where to start from the training perspective. Classification is a bit of a different bag of worms and something I've looked into before, but yeah, I don't know. That's not my specialty for sure.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Steve.
Yeah,
I do have one more question for all of our presenters, but I wanted to see if we had any more questions from the people who are on the call today. Okay, so my last question would be again from a coaching perspective, and it's maybe aimed at all three of you in the different contexts that you work in. Do coaches really have a good understanding of what a movement screen is and what a movement screen can do? I think I know the answer, but I'd like to get your perspectives on that.
Well, I got my mic on, so I can start. I've had experience working with a number of different coaches, and I'll try to say this nicely. I think it really depends on the coach. I've had some coaches that are really hands-on with the strength and conditioning piece, and I've had coaches that really leave it alone, and they think of it as something that should be done, but they're more concerned with the technical tactical areas. If I look at soccer, for the most part, my experience with it, most of the coaches wanted them to get fitter, and that was about it, as long as they did that part of it. And I've had some other coaches, when I worked with wheelchair basketball, like Tim Frick was super hands-on, and he was right into it. So my experience is it really depends on who you're dealing with, and from screens to strength and conditioning. I mean, Sean's may be different, I don't know, but that's what I've experienced.
Yeah, maybe Nicole, if you've got anything to add or any thoughts, in the context you're in, and then we'll finish with Sean.
Yeah, like I said, I think it really depends on the sport and what they're trying to get out of it, right? Like sometimes it's not always applicable to do movement screens. Like there are cases where we work with just camps, right? And they have a lot of athletes rolling through, and as simple as the FMS is, sometimes it's just too much to do in the time frame as well. And you have sometimes coaches that don't necessarily see that as the most important factor. So I think it depends on the coach and what they see as the biggest weakness and how we can help facilitate that. And it's not always necessarily a movement screen. It could be different components, right? How do they work on recovery, and what are some modalities that way that we can implement so that they can recover and play again? So I think it depends on the coach for sure.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Nicole. Sean, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll start by saying the same thing. It kind of depends on the coaches, but to look at it differently, I guess specific to the sports I've worked with, moguls being a judge sport, the coaches would refer to it as a technical sport. These coaches, they were quite involved in the movement screens. They would be in the physiotherapist room watching the athlete on the table, how they were doing things, because that was important for them. Because like I said, if an athlete can't lift their arms over their head correctly, then they can't do the jump execution or skill development that those coaches were looking for. And then my experiences in swimming. So my background was I was a former swimmer, and I kind of have this hybrid role now where I do mostly strength and conditioning, but a little bit of swim coaching as well. And that's kind of like Steve was saying about the soccer players, they want them to get fitter. That's in what I've seen in most swim coaches' domain is the physiological development. So they're not necessarily looking at the movement screens as much because they want to focus on the conditioning aspect of things. But if you have a swim coach or, any type of sport coach that is, quite interested and intrigued in the biomechanics and how better biomechanics will lead to better performance and healthier athletes, and I think those coaches are quite interested in the movement screen results. That's been my experience with those two different sports. And then tennis was I didn't work directly with any of the coaches. I just worked with the player development director from the provincial team, and he was quite interested in the results and providing those exercise packages to the athletes.
Okay, thanks, Sean. That's great. Thank you very much. So I'd like to finish, if there are no other questions, just a big thank you to our presenters today, Nicole, Steve, and Sean. I really enjoyed listening to your comments and thoughts there, and again, a big thank you to everybody who was on the call today. I know the end of March is a difficult period of time, so I'm grateful to you for registering and showing up and coming along. We will have the recording and the slides posted on our website probably sometime towards the back end of next week. And when that's all set up, I'll just drop you a quick email with a link to let you know that it's available for you to look at. So again, thanks everybody. Enjoy the long weekend and look forward to seeing everybody again in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
everybody.
Andrew. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
Bye.